You think you know the Vikings, horned helmets, savage raids, and a life of endless warfare. But what if most of what you've heard is wrong? From misunderstood warriors to forgotten farmers, the truth about the Norse is far more fascinating than fiction. In this video, we're busting the biggest myths about the Vikings and revealing the real stories buried beneath centuries of legend. Let us begin with the most famous falsehood of all, the horned helmet. Picture a Viking and what do you see? A snarling brute in a horned helm. But what if I told you that image is a complete fabrication? A myth crafted not by time, but by artists, playwrights, and costume designers long after the Viking Age had ended. It was born not in the halls of a longhouse, but on the stages of 19th century Europe. In 1876, German composer Richard Wagner premiered his epic opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen. The costume designers, wanting to give the Norse gods and heroes a powerful primal look, added horns to the helmets worn by the characters. The result? Striking, dramatic, and completely inaccurate. Romantic artists soon followed suit, painting bold warriors with winged and horned headgear, fueling the fantasy. By the turn of the century, this theatrical image had etched itself into popular imagination, replacing reality. Real history tells a different story. To date, not a single horned helmet from the Viking Age has ever been uncovered by archaeologists. Instead, what we find are practical, no-nonsense pieces of military gear. The most famous Viking helmet ever discovered is the Geirmundur helmet, unearthed in Norway in 1943. Made of iron, with a rounded cap and a guard that protected the nose and eyes, it was built for battle, efficient, sturdy, and horn-free. Imagine fighting in a shield wall with heavy horns dragging your head down or snagging on a fellow warrior's gear. In the chaos of battle, such ornaments would be not only foolish, they could be fatal. To be fair, horned helmets did exist, but long before the Viking Age. Some date back to the Bronze Age, over 1,000 years before the first Viking raids. These were ceremonial pieces likely worn by chieftains or shamans during religious rituals, not by raiders charging into battle. A pair of stunning horned helmets was found in Viksø, Denmark, dating back to around 900 BCE. But these belong to a world of myth and ceremony, not the practical reality of Viking warfare. So why does the horned helmet myth endure? Because it works, it's bold, memorable, and symbolic. From silent films to Marvel comics to Viking-themed video games, the horned helmet has become a kind of cultural shorthand. But just like cowboys didn't wear 10-gallon hats in gunfights, and pirates didn't make enemies walk the plank, the horned Viking is a legend born of imagination, not reality. So the next time you see a horned Viking, know that you're looking not at history, but at theatre. The real Vikings were far more practical, ironclad, hardened by war, and focused on survival. Their helmets didn't need horns. Their deeds spoke loudly enough. Myth has its place, but truth, as the schools say, often wears simpler armor. Before we move on to the next myth, picture again a Viking in your mind. How was the appearance? Did you imagine a brute covered in grime and guts? The stereotype of the filthy Viking didn't come from their contemporaries, but from their enemies, particularly Christian monks who chronicled the Viking raids. To them, the Norse were heathens, invaders, and enemies of the church. Naturally, they portrayed them as unwashed savages. These biased accounts were passed down and repeated. Add a dash of Hollywood and a pinch of dramatic flair, and the myth of the dirty Viking was born. But archaeologists have uncovered a very different story, one buried alongside the Vikings themselves. Across Scandinavia and beyond, graves from the Viking Age contain an unexpected collection of items: combs carved from antler or bone, small knives and razors, tweezers, and even ear spoons. These weren't rare treasures, they were everyday tools, often carried in small leather pouches. Some were intricately decorated, suggesting that grooming wasn't just a necessity, it was a matter of personal pride. Cleanliness wasn't just a luxury, it was a part of Viking culture. Norse men were known to bathe at least once a week, which might not sound like much today, but compared to their European contemporaries, it was quite frequent. In fact, The Anglo-Saxons commented, often bitterly, on how the Viking men in their cities were too clean. They accused them of washing regularly, combing their hair daily, and even changing their clothes more often. Why? Because it made them more attractive to local women. The Vikings took pride in their appearance. Their clothing was dyed in vibrant colors using natural plant materials. Their hair was often styled, sometimes shaved in intricate patterns or braided. Both men and women wore jewelry, from brooches to beads to arm rings. Even soapstone has been found at Viking sites, suggesting they had materials for cleansing. They also knew how to use lye, made from ashes, a crude but effective form of soap. Far from filthy, the Norse had an understanding of hygiene that was ahead of its time. So why does this myth still linger? Because it's easier to paint your enemies as savages than to admit they were not so different from you. The truth is, the Vikings weren't dirty barbarian. They were complex people, warriors and traders, farmers and craftsmen, and yes, frequent users of combs. Next is the myth of the Viking as a ruthless raider, which comes largely from the victims of their attacks. Monks and chroniclers in England and Francia recorded brutal raids on monasteries and towns, stories passed down through generations. But these sources tell only one side, the clash of sword and shield. They rarely mention the farmers who stayed behind, the traders on peaceful missions, or the craftsmen who built the very ships used in those raids. In truth, most Vikings were farmers. The Norse homestead was the heart of society. Livestock, grains, vegetables, these were the real wealth of the Viking age. A man's honor was not just won on the battlefield, but in how well he tended his land and provided for his kin. The growing season in Scandinavia was short, the winters long and harsh. To survive, the Norse had to be skilled stewards of the land. Men, women, and children all had roles to play: milking, spinning wool, gathering herbs, and preserving food for the dark months ahead. And then there were the artisans, the silent architects of the Viking world. Blacksmiths shaped iron into tools, weapons, and nails for ships. Woodworkers carved beams and planks for longhouses and seaworthy vessels. Viking ships were engineering marvels of their time, designed not only for speed in raids, but for long-distance trade and exploration. Behind every warrior was a builder, a smith, a carver, craftsmen whose names rarely appear in the sagas, but without whom the sagas could not exist. Not all voyages were raids. Many Viking expeditions were peaceful, with merchant journeying across rivers and seas. The Norse traded amber, furs, walrus ivory, and iron in exchange for silver, silk, wine, and spices. They sailed not just west to England, but east to Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate. Some even served as elite guards to emperors in Constantinople. Far from isolated barbarians, the Vikings were part of a vast network of trade and culture that stretched across continents. Women, too, were central to Viking society. While some picked up weapons, most wielded power in other ways, as heads of households, merchants, and medicine keepers. With men often away at sea, women managed farms, estates, and family affairs. Their influence was quiet, but immense. Daily Viking life was rich with ritual and routine. From seasonal feast to storytelling by firelight, their culture was vibrant, structured, and deeply rooted in the land. However, when we say Vikings, we often speak as if they were one people, one army, marching to the same war drum. But this is a simplification, a myth born of hindsight. The truth is far more fragmented, far more human. There was no Viking empire, no singular banner, only a web of clans, petty kingdoms, and shifting allegiances, often at odds with each other as much as with the rest of the world. Scandinavia in the Viking age was a landscape carved by mountains, rivers, and sea. These natural boundaries created isolation, and with it diversity. The Norse hailed primarily from what we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Each of these regions had its own dialects, chieftains, and customs. In Norway, the rugged terrain produced fiercely independent clans who relied on the sea to connect isolated communities. Denmark, with its flatter lands and access to continental Europe, was more politically centralized. Sweden looked eastward, trading and raiding along the rivers of the Baltic and into what is now Russia. There was no Viking empire, no single king ruling all Norse peoples. Authority rested with local rulers, jarls, and petty kings whose power often extended no further than a single fjord or valley. When large raids occurred, like those that struck England and Francia, they were rarely launched by a united Viking nation, but by opportunistic coalitions of warriors, sometimes from different regions, sometimes from rival clans temporarily allied by profit. While Viking raids abroad are well known, lesser told are the battles battles fought between Vikings themselves. Civil wars, feuds, and rival successions were common. In Norway, King Harald Fairhair fought a long campaign to unify the western coastal regions, often battling other Norse chieftains. In Denmark, royal succession was frequently contested, with exiled princes seeking allies abroad. Even the legendary warrior Ivar the Boneless, though a feared raider of Anglo-Saxon England, first earned his reputation in conflicts among his fellow Danes and Swedes. Despite shared beliefs in gods like Odin and Thor, and common practices like shipbuilding, cultural differences ran deep. Swedish Vikings, often called the Ruts, travelled east, founding trade routes and settlements along the rivers of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, Norwegian Vikings ventured west to Ireland, Scotland, and Iceland. Danish Vikings focused on England and the Frankish coast. Even their burial rites varied, from ship burials in Norway to stone circles in Sweden to mound graves in Denmark. These weren't just regional quirks, they were reflections of distinct identities. So why do we still speak of the Vikings as if they were one unified people? Partly, it's convenience. It's easier to tell stories of conquest and adventure with one name, one face. And later, European historians, romanticizing the Viking Age, often overlooked its tribal complexity. But to truly understand the Norse, we must peel back the myth of unity. The Viking Age was not the march of a monolithic horde. It was a storm of scattered clans, rival kings, and bold individuals, each with their own ambitions and their own paths. To speak of the Vikings is to speak in generalities. Behind the word lies a world as fractured, vibrant, and complex as any in history. The image of the Vikings being nothing more than mindless raiders is another stereotype burned into popular memory. Viking warriors leaping from their ships, axes raised, flames behind them. Mindless raiders driven only by blood and plunder. But what if I told you that image is only half the story, if that? Yes, the Vikings raided. Monasteries, coastal villages, and river ports from Ireland to France bore the scars of their attacks. But they didn't just take, they traded, they negotiated, they built lasting economic networks that spanned continents. Vikings were skilled merchants who understood the value of not just gold, but relationships. They sailed to Byzantium, the Abbasid Caliphate, and even Central Asia. Along these routes, they exchanged furs, walrus ivory, and slaves for silk, spices, silver, and glassware. To call them mindless raiders is to ignore the mind behind the voyage, the strategy, the navigation, the risk, and the reward. While Norsemen from Norway and Denmark turned their longships west, Swedish Vikings ventured eastward. They navigated the great rivers of Russia, establishing trading posts along the Dnieper and Volga. These routes connected the north with the Islamic and Byzantine worlds. In cities like Novgorod and Kiev, Viking merchants traded with Arab traders and Byzantine envoys. Viking artifacts have been found as far south as Baghdad, alongside Arabic silver coins discovered in hoards across Scandinavia. The Vikings didn't just travel to trade, they built entire towns for it. Places like Hedeby in modern-day Germany, Birka in Sweden, and Kalpang in Norway became bustling trade centers. These weren't raiding outposts, they were organized marketplaces with docks, workshops, and homes. Craftsmen forged tools and jewelry. Foreign traders brought wine, silk, and beads. Coins from England, Francia, and the Middle East were found in abundance, proving the reach of Viking commerce. These towns weren't scenes of conquest, they were hubs of connection. The Vikings were not simply muscle, they were master navigators. Their ships were marvels of engineering, shallow-drafted, symmetrical, and fast. These vessels enabled them to reach inland rivers, cross oceans, and return home quickly. They used the sun, stars, and even special sunstones to navigate in poor weather. They learned the rhythms of wind and current. These were not random marauders, but explorers who studied the world and mastered its pathways. Vikings were also pragmatic negotiators. They didn't always take by force. Sometimes they settled by agreement. In Ireland, they founded the city of Dublin and became part of the fabric of local politics. In France, Viking leader Rollo was granted land in exchange for peace. This land became Normandy. Wherever they went, they adapted. They intermarried, adopted languages, and established trade systems. The mindless raider could never have done that, but a savvy merchant explorer, that's the Viking who shaped history. Stories, however, speak of Norsemen like giant, towering, muscle-bound warriors who dwarfed their enemies. But when we leave the saga and step into the soil, the truth is humbler. The Viking warrior was not a giant carved from myth, but a man forged by hardship, skill, and endurance. In the Norse sagas, heroes like Egil Skallagrimsson and Ragnar Lothbrok are described with near mythical strength and stature. But sagas are stories, tales meant to inspire, exaggerate, and entertain. Archaeology offers a clearer lens. Thousands of Viking graves have been unearthed across Scandinavia and beyond, and through these skeletal remains, remains, scientists have reconstructed the true height of the Norse people. The average Viking man stood around 5 feet 7 inches, or about 170 centimeters. Viking women averaged closer to 5 foot 2. These heights were not unusual for the time. In fact, they were nearly identical to the Anglo-Saxons, Franks and Celts they fought. No towering difference, no superhuman scale, just human beings hardened by cold winters and laborious lives. Their strength didn't come from mythical size, it came from training, endurance, and grit. From the time they could walk, Norse children helped work the land, fish the seas, and carry the burdens of survival. By the time they came of age, Viking men were accustomed to rowing for hours, hiking across harsh terrain, and swinging axes not just in battle, to build their world. Their bodies were shaped by necessity, not for show, but for survival. They didn't need to be giants, they needed to endure. The myth of the giant Viking persists because it's powerful. It fits the fantasy, these unstoppable warriors storming foreign shores. It's the version we see in films, games, and popular fiction, but it's just that, fiction. They say the Vikings were illiterate brutes, savages who left no written word, only blood and ruin. But listen closely, and you'll hear something else. Runes whisper their stories still, etched in stone, carved in bone, scratched into wood, symbols that survive the centuries. The Viking Age may have roared with axe and flame, but it also spoke in ink and iron. The Vikings had their own writing system, the runes. Early on, they used the Elder Futhar, a script of 24 characters. As time passed, this evolved into the Younger Futhar, a more compact form adapted to their language's needs. These were not just crude scratches. Runes had power. They carried names, messages, prayers, and curses. They marked grave sites, boundary stones, weapons, and even everyday objects. They were sacred and practical, tools of magic and memory. Archaeological finds show that runes weren't just reserved for the elite. In Bergen, Norway, hundreds of wooden rune sticks have been found. Letters, business messages, jokes, and even love notes. One stick reads, "I love her with all my heart, may she love me back." Another, more humorous, says, "You've gotten yourself a beard full of lice." These weren't mighty spells or royal decrees, just ordinary words from ordinary people. Proof that literacy, while not universal, was far more common than the old myths suggest. And then there were the skalds, the poets of the Norse world. They were not only performers, but historians, satirists, and keepers of memory. Their verse was intricate, their vocabulary vast. A true skald had to master kennings, metaphoric phrases like whale road for sea or battle sweat for blood. One skald wrote,
"The wound sea runs red on the shield's bright. War is a storm, the wolf is..."
Their poetry was memorized, yes, but also recorded later by scribes, especially in Iceland, where the literary tradition would outlive the Viking Age itself. Runestones remain among the most powerful expressions of Viking writing. They didn't just mark graves, they told stories, cemented alliances, praised the dead, and called on the gods. The Jelling stones in Denmark, commissioned by King Harald Bluetooth, read, "Harald who won all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian," and the Rökstone in Sweden, a cryptic marvel of poetry and myth carved with over 700 runes that are still being studied today. These were not brutish relics, they were public art, political declarations, and sacred verse carved for the ages. So why do we still call them illiterate brutes? Because war overshadows words, because fire makes a louder sound than a chisel, and because popular culture still favors the axe over the pen. But the truth remains, carved in wood and stone. The Vikings had words, they had voice, and long after their battles faded, their stories still stand, letter by letter, rune by rune. Let us now consider another misconception, that Viking women had no rights. In a time when much of Europe saw women as property, Viking society stood apart. While not equal by modern standards, Norse women enjoyed a surprising level of autonomy, agency, and power. Women could own land, inherit property, and manage estates. If a woman's husband died, she didn't vanish into poverty. She could take over his affairs, continue running the household, and even defend her claim in court. Under Norse law, the women had the right to buy and sell goods, appear as witnesses, and settle dispute. This legal power wasn't granted by a king, it was embedded in the culture's sense of justice and honor. And that wasn't just theoretical, it played out in the public courts where even women's voices could carry weight. Marriage in Viking culture was often a union of families and wealth, but it wasn't a prison. Norse women could initiate divorce, and they didn't need to accuse adultery or violence to do it. If the relationship soured, a woman could declare her intent in front of witnesses and she'd be free. Divorced women didn't lose their status. They often returned to their birth families or managed their own property. Even the saga literature is filled with bold, independent women who made their own decisions about love, marriage, and loyalty. Beyond household rights, some women wielded political power. Queens and noblewomen often served as regents, diplomats, and estate managers while their husbands were away raiding or trading. In Iceland, the legendary the Deep-Minded is said to have led settlers, founded a farmstead, and held land in her own name. In the realm of myth and memory, women appear as wise seers, known as völur, and priestesses who mediated between the mortal and the divine. They weren't just silent spectators in the Viking world, they were architects of it. And then there's the most debated figure of all, the Shield Maiden. Did Viking women really fight in battle? The sagas speak of fierce women like Lagertha and Brynhild, wielding blades alongside men. Some graves, like one discovered in Birka, Sweden, contain female remains buried with weapons and war gear. Was she a warrior, or honored in death with symbolic arms? Scholars continue to debate it. What is clear is that the idea of women as warriors was not unthinkable in Norse culture. Whether rare exception or ritual role, the Shield Maiden remains a compelling part of the Viking imagination. So where did the myth of powerless Viking women come from? Likely from later Christian chroniclers, usually outsiders, who misunderstood the Norse legal system or dismissed women's roles as insignificant. And in our own time, popular media has long favored the image of the male raider, overshadowing the lives of the women who built and preserved the Viking world from behind the front lines. When we speak of the Viking Age, we often speak of violence, of raids and pillage, axes and fire. But the truth is quieter, more complex. Because for most of their 300-year history, the Norse lived not as raiders but as settlers, farmers and families. The Viking Age spanned roughly 3 centuries, from the late 8th century to the middle of the 11th. That's a longer stretch of time than between the American Revolution and today. Raids were part of that story, yes, but they came in waves driven by politics, famine, revenge, or opportunity. These were not constant campaigns, but seasonal ventures, just one thread in a much broader tapestry. Back home in Scandinavia, most Vikings lived ordinary lives where they raised livestock, grew barley and oats, and traded furs and iron. Longhouses weren't just homes, they were the hearts of extended families, places of storytelling, feasting, and worship. Communities gathered at a local assembly where disputes were settled, alliances formed, and laws spoken aloud. These gatherings weren't lawless, they were structured, democratic, and deeply rooted in tradition. The Norse were builders and explorers. They constructed elegant longships crafted not just for war, but for trade and travel. They founded towns like Dublin, Hedeby, and Jorvik. They settled Iceland, reached Greenland, and even set foot in North America 500 years before Columbus. These were not acts of mindless raiding. They were calculated ventures and extensions of a culture that valued mobility, opportunity, and resilience. Raiding was often a summer job, a few weeks or months at most. The rest of the year was filled with the demands of survival, planting, harvesting, preserving food, repairing tools, and raising children. Not every Norseman picked up a sword. Many never left home. Their lives were shaped more by the seasons than by war. To say the Viking Age was all raiding all the time is like saying medieval Europe was one long crusade. It misses the everyday world that truly defined the era. The Viking Age was born of many forces: trade and travel, myth and memory, survival and ambition. Raids may have made the headlines of their time, but peace made the culture. And it's in that peace, in their laws, their farms, their ships, their stories, that we still feel their presence today. So now you know the horned helmets, false, the filth, exaggerated, the truth, far more human and far more fascinating. The Norse were not monsters from the sea, but men and women of vision, courage, and complexity. Let the myths fall away and see them not as legends, but as they truly were. Subscribe for more Viking stories. Until next time, may the winds favor your sails.